Edwin. We're glad to have you here tonight. Edwin Hill's critically acclaimed crime novels include Watch Her, The Missing Ones, and Little Comfort. He has been nominated for Edgar and Agatha Awards, featured in Us magazine, received starred reviews in Publishers Weekly, Booklist, and Library Journal, and was recognized as one of 6 crime writers to watch in Mystery Scene magazine. His latest novel, The Secrets We Share, will be available in, April of 2022. He lives in Roslindale, Massachusetts with his partner, Michael, and his favorite reviewer, their lab, Edith Ann, who likes his first drafts enough to eat them, and my dogs too. I completely understand that. Welcome, Michael. Welcome, Edwin. I'm like, your partner's Michael. Hello.
Hello. Hi, everyone. It's so nice to be here today. Thanks for having me. It's very hot here in Massachusetts, which it never gets hot here. So we all die as soon as it gets over 80. So my hair looks especially good, I can tell from Zoom. I'm going to talk tonight a little bit about a technique that I used. So the novel that comes out in April, The Secrets We Share, I wrote during the COVID pandemic, and like a lot of us, I had a lot of trouble concentrating during that time. And so I sort of developed this system of how to look at the novel that I'll introduce you to. I'm going to walk you through some character exercises and some structure exercises first. So a couple things. Everything that I say is a tool in a toolbox. It may be useful to you, and that's awesome. If it is, use it. And if it's not, just toss it away. You don't need to use it. Like, all writing advice should be all writing advice is the same. If it's useful, use it. And if it's not useful, forget it. You may have heard some of this before. Hopefully I'll be able to give it a new spin so that you can see it in a different light. I teach all the time on Zoom. I teach it in an MFA program, so you aren't going to mess me up if you interrupt me. So just if you have a question, just shout it out, or put it in the chat, or raise your hand, or whatever. But please make this into a conversation if you would like to. What else? Oh, and no one ever chooses this program. So you guys are my guinea pigs too. This is the first time I'm doing this one. So I'd love to hear what you can either write me afterwards, or I'd just love to hear what you thought of it after we go through it. So let me share my screen. And how do I get up? I think I go over here, present. Okay. Let me move everyone's faces over here. So we're going to walk through a couple different things tonight, and I'm going to start with some really basic character activity. I really think that for me, the secret to the novel, the way into a novel is really through character motivation. We're going to look at the structure, the general structure of a 3-act novel. That's a novel with a beginning, a middle, and an end. That's really all that means for a 3-act novel. And then we're going to develop an episode in one of our TV episodes. This is actually from another presentation. Sorry. Oops. You are not going to need a set of index cards, but you are going to need a paper and pencil or a computer, because we're going to do a couple of writing exercises. And there are no handouts, but I'll be happy to share the slides afterwards if folks want them. And I'll go for about a half hour, and then I'll take questions at, sorry, I have to do math now, at 7:45. So let's just talk a little bit about character development. We're going to talk first about just some basic aspects of character development, and then we're going to get into diving into the motivation behind your character. So one of the things I'd really like you to think about right now is the protagonist in whatever your work in progress is. like who that person is and what you know about that character. And we're going to spend a little time delving into what you might not know about that character. You might discover some things about that character. So here are some really, we're not going to do this exercise down at the bottom, but here are some really basic things that you want to ask yourself about your protagonist. And you want to come at them from different angles. So appearance, right? So think about appearance. When you're thinking about appearance, think about the things that that you can return to. Lou Berney is a great mystery writer, and he has this really awesome tool that he uses. And once you see it everywhere in his novel. He'll find something like my hair could be something that you could return to in a novel, to key in the reader to who that character is, and you can return to that item about that person, so that you don't have to say, oh, Rebecca's on the page again. You can say, the guy with the hair that was out of control that night is back on the page. So choosing something about an appearance that you can return to and use to remind the reader about a character. Accessories are one of my favorite things to use with the character, and I like them to be very, I like to use them when they are contrary to what you think they're going to be. So think about a car. A character can have a car. A very rich person can have a Ferrari, and a very poor person can have a beat up Ford. But an even more interesting thing to do is to have a very rich person with a beat up Ford and a poor person with a Ferrari. And that's like an accessory that you can give to your character that will make them stand out on the page. What the character says and how they say it. So think about a character who says, "Can I please have the ketchup?" And then think about a character who says, "Give me the ketchup." There's a big difference between the way that character is saying those two pieces of dialogue. What a character does and how they do it. I love using actions, contrary actions in stories. So you'll have a character say, "I hate you," and then they do an action that shows you that you love them. Or you have a character say, "I love you so much," and then you have an action that says, actually, this person doesn't really love that person. So you use that contrast to help build that character. Everyone knows what backstory is. Backstory is what happened before we got to where we are now in the story. And then I write a lot of my books are told from multiple points of view. So I really love the idea of using contrasting views on a character. So a character presents in one way when they're telling the story. The way another character talks about that character may be very different from the way that character sees themselves. If you're writing in a single point of view, you can actually have characters when they're talking about other characters within the story. You can set up contrasting viewpoints on a specific character. I'll skip to the last one. The narrative that I really love. I do this with my MFA students a lot. Understanding the role of your narrator in a story, I think, is so important, and it's really important to character development in particular. And there are a couple of things that you can do with a narrator. And I always encourage my students, to know where the narrator is in time and where that narrator is telling the story from. And is the narrator telling the stories 10 minutes from now? So like the narrator is looking back 10 minutes, or is the narrator looking back 10 years? And there's going to be a big difference between those two things, and what how retrospective the story can be, and what knowledge the narrator can bring if they're reflecting back on the scene, on the characters that way. So there are some basic aspects of character development. Okay, now we're going to get into character motivation. Try telling this story. A man finds a lamp with a genie inside. A genie says, "I'll grant you 3 wishes. Whatever you desire, it can be yours." And the man says, "That's okay. I'm pretty content as I am." There's no story there, right? There's no drama. There's no tension. The guy's happy living his life the way he's been living it. Now try telling this story. A man finds a lamp with a genie inside. And the genie says, I'll grant you 3 wishes, whatever you desire, it can be yours. And the man says, could you help me forgive myself? Well, there are all different routes that you can take in this story. You can think about the regrets that the man has. You can think of, like, we're all murder mystery. We all write murder mystery. So you can think about the murder that he actually committed. But there's all sorts of places that you can go with this story. And that all comes down to character motivation. What does the character want? So very quickly, I like to use this thing with my student. It's called the Motivational Continuum. And in real life, we sort of live in the middle of the motivational continuum. We live in the world of expectations. And especially if you are like me and you don't like a lot of conflict, that's where you kind of want to sit. And so if you think about the idea of expectations, they're the things that you do every day. They're the things that you get up and you're expected to do. So like these are 2 of my expectations. I expect to finish the manuscript that's due at the end of the month, and I expect to lead a successful class on Tuesday when I'm on campus. Thankfully, I actually met that first expectation because I did this slide a month or so ago. So really quickly, just think about your own life and what one or 2 of your expectations might be. And real hint, these are really boring and mundane things, like you're expected to eat healthy. So just take 1 minute to write those down. I want to read that story, Kristen. Okay, so now that you have your expectations, we're going to move out from here. And right outside, so if you look at, so expectations are right in the middle, and then right outside of expectations are your dreams, dreams and your 2 steps away from expectations, sorry, are your dreams and your dreads. So that's where you really want to keep your story centered on your dreams and your dreads. I have 2 examples up here. I dream of having this book reviewed in the New York Times, and I dread that the manuscript will be rejected, my contract will be canceled, and I'll die in obscurity. And then I have a second one. I dream of inspiring my students to become leaders, and I dread getting terrible evaluations that will lead me to being fired. And a couple things about your dreams and your dreads is they're further away from expectations than hopes and fears would be. Like a hope would just be something like, you know, I hope my editor will like the book and give it extra marketing dollars. Whereas the dream is really something that I don't really have that much control over, but it's something that might propel the story further than the hope would. The other thing about the hopes and the dreams, about the dreams and the dreads, is that they're not opposite of each other. So if you look at my first example here, I dream of having the book reviewed in the New York Times, but the opposite of getting reviewed in the New York Times is not getting reviewed in the New York Times, right? But my dread here is actually dying in obscurity, which is like a much further emotion there. And again, with the first one, I dream of inspiring my students to greatness, but the opposite of that isn't that my students aren't great. It's that I get fired because I'm so terrible at my job. So now, just go. So here is here's the motivational continuum. I use this all the time in story making, and I'll get to the point of this in a sec. I use this all the time in story making to make sure that, especially in the very first part of a novel, the motivation of the characters is really, really clear. And I often will put in a sentence, especially in an early draft, I'll say, you know, so-and-so dreaded or so-and-so dreamed of, and I'll complete that sentence and then write a few paragraphs around that. in subsequent revisions, I sort of take out the obvious language around that and sort of build scenes around it so that it becomes a little bit more nuanced. But I always want to make sure that I have those dreams and those dreads like solidly based in the manuscript. So we're going to take, we're not going to take 5 minutes. We're going to take 3 minutes. And what I want you to do is think about your protagonist and in whatever your work in progress is, and think about what is driving that character. What is it that they are either dreaming about? What is it that they really, really want? Or what are they dreading? What is motivating, what's motivating them around dread at the beginning of your story? And then we're going to share. So be brave and share. So 3 minutes, and then we'll come back. So take about 60 seconds to finish up. All right. So anyone want to share what they got? Tell us about your protagonist and what are they dreaming about or dreading?
I'll share.
Go for it, Barb.
Okay. In my novel, murder has taken place and in the protagonist community, and the person murdered was not particularly popular, not hated, but just one of those people who are just kind of dismissed. And her entire motivation is becoming involved in solving this, or the solution is her feeling of justice, that there needs to be a human connection at all times, and she just can't get her head around the dismissal, the unfairness, oh, I read about it in the paper, but now I'm going to go to the grocery store kind of thing that she sees in the community. And she's a quiet person, but something inside her just demands this involvement, this justice, and she just can't give it up until she she figures this out or helps the situation, even though she personally was not all that involved with this person, but she just can't live with the kind of callous dismissal of the society. That's
So how do you make that? So how do you make that personal when you look at this character and you really dive into her psychology? What is it that, like, when she sees herself in that victim's place, what is it that she's dreading might happen to herself? Is she seeing something that might have happened to her in the past?
well, in the past, and I have not developed it as much as I should yet, I don't feel, but in her past, she was someone who in college or wherever was one of those good students, but nobody really noticed them. They sort of drifted through, you'd make a comment, but people would be like, oh yeah. And I went to a part, total. And so for her, even though that's not her present lifestyle, she's very loved and she's very admired by her husband and her children. That has changed. There's still that deep-seated part in her that when something happens, it galls her, I guess is the best way I can say it at this point of my character development.
I love that. And what I would encourage you to do is like try to make it personal and try to connect your protagonist to the to that feeling of worthlessness. So like this community is saying that this person was worthless, and what is that bringing out in her that's making her so interested in solving this crime? That's awesome. Anyone else want to share?
So it feels like what everyone is saying is that they dread oblivion and they dream of celebration. That seems like that's true with yours too, Edwin. So I thought of that in terms of my character, who's named Arthur, and he's a kid and his parents own a junk store. And so he dreads a life of being ordinary and working in a junk store, which is what he sees his parents doing. And he dreams of being a celebrated detective.
Oh, nice. So, and how does it manifest itself in the story?
Well, he finds a mystery. It's nobody dies. This is for kids, but he finds a mystery that he wants to solve and that he thinks he can solve, and he starts working on solving it.
And he tries to solve it because he wants to be famous.
Yeah, now I feel like I am too influenced by what other people have said. And I'm not sure. I think it's more that, now I'm thinking, oh God, cliche, he's finding his passion. He wants to find the thing that he's good at, and he doesn't want it to be something ordinary. Like, he's very good at customer service in the store, and everybody always says, Arthur, you're so good at customer service.
Yeah.
And he doesn't really want to be good at customer service, or not just customer service.
So that's great. So I actually did a little bit of a contrast in my last novel. So I had the one that is coming out in April, I had two main characters in that, two sisters, and one of them dreams of being very famous, and the other one dreads notoriety. And that sort of sets up the conflict between them, or the conflict in the novel. So you can play with all sorts of different things. There are a million different dreads, and there are a million different dreams. But understand when you're drafting your character, your story, understand what that motivation is, and make sure that your reader understands it right from the start. And I'm going to show you how to do that how I did that in my sort of 8-step process. I'm going to skip over this stuff. This is something important to remember. Your story is about taking that dream or taking that dread, and what you're doing is you're setting up your character so that there is a chance that the dream is going to be dashed, they're not going to achieve their dream, or the dread is going to be stirred up. Okay, and that's what your story is about. So like if the dread is stirred up, then the character has to face that dread. If the dream is going to be dashed, the character has to fight to achieve that dream. So and your reader wants to understand that your character is trying to do those things. Okay, so I'm going to skip over this part. And now I'm going to go over a little bit of structure. Can everyone see my screen? This is the basic structure. Sorry, I'm moving your faces around on my screen so that I can see what I'm talking about. This is the basic structure of a story. This is called the modified Freytag pyramid. And a lot of storytellers only need this structure in order to tell a story. You have I'll define what all of these things are. in just a sec. But you have an inciting incident toward the beginning of your novel. That's where the protagonist makes a decision that they can't come back from. So, and I'll get into an example that everyone will understand in just a second. And then there's a climax at the end. That's when all of the action comes together, everything collides. I always think of like those superhero movies that I never go and watch, but you think about the climax of a superhero movie. That's where like all of the superheroes converge at one place and they have one gigantic battle because all of those stories are converging and coming together into one final moment. A lot of people, this is all they need. So they'll come up with the inciting incident, they'll come up with the climax, and then they'll just string scenes together to connect those, and they'll keep it very tight the entire time so that they ultimately have a story. That doesn't quite work for me. I need a little more structure. And so this is what's called a 3-act structure. And basically, it's pretty straightforward. You have act 1, which is the beginning, and that's about a quarter of the novel. You have and there, by the way, everything I'm telling you, there are a million exceptions to everything. So, but this is a structure that I use. So in my structure, the act 1 would be about a quarter of the novel, act 2 would be half of the novel, and act 3 would be the last quarter of the novel. Some people will write a 3-act structure with each act being equal, so 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. And that's just another model that a lot of people will follow. So these are items, these are little pieces of the 3-act structure that I really love. And I'll get into the definitions of these in just a second. Plot point 1 happens at the end of act 1. The midpoint happens right in the dead center of act 2. So you do half of act 2, and then you have a midpoint, and then you have the second half of act 2. And then plot point 2 happens at the end of act 2. And what these things are they're exciting events in the story that sort of change the plot a little bit. I'll get into an example in just a sec. Here we go. Here are the definitions. So we have our inciting incident. This is the place where your protagonist makes a decision, one from which she can't return. Plot point 1 is the event in the story that takes the plot in a different direction. So that means like the story was going one way and all of a sudden something happens, a murder, like in a murder mystery, it's often a murder. And all of a sudden we're investigating a murder. The midpoint's a really important part of the novel. This is the event at the dead center of your novel that again takes the story in a different direction. And just think of it as an exciting thing that you're working toward. And you can guess what plot point 2 it is. It's the third event in your story that takes the plot in a different direction. The climax is when everything converges together, and the denouement is sort of the moment after the climax, where you sort of tie up all the loose ends. And now I'm going to show you an example that everyone will understand of these things. So we're going to use The Wizard of Oz, the movie, not the book, as an example. So this is important. So the inciting incident in The Wizard of Oz, the movie, is when Dorothy runs away from home to save Toto from imminent death. And why is that? That's important because there are a couple of things that happen here. Dorothy has to make a choice at that point, right? It's either Toto lives or Toto dies. There's no in between. And so she makes the choice to run away so that Toto can live, right? The other important thing here, and I think this is really, really important in mystery fiction in particular, who makes the decision in this inciting incident? Dorothy makes the decision, right? So it's Dorothy who is our protagonist, is making an active decision that changes the course of this story. So now we can go through plot point 1 is after going on her journey, Dorothy sets out to find the wizard. Some people say that in The Wizard of Oz, the plot point 1 is when when the movie goes from black and white to color. So when she opens the door, but I always like plot points to be active decisions. And so like opening a door is not an active decision, but deciding to go find the wizard, that is an active decision. And so that shows your protagonist making a decision that changes the course of the plot. The midpoint in this story is when the wizard sends Dorothy on the quest to kill the Wicked Witch. She decides to go on that quest. Plot point 2 is when she actually kills the witch. The climax is when we learn that the wizard is a sham. And the denouement is when Dorothy and all of her friends get what they wanted all along. Okay, so those are the basics of the structure. So this last year, I was having a lot of trouble. So I'd always use this. I'd written 3 books. I'd used this model for all 3 of these books, and it had been fine. But I was having a lot of trouble concentrating, and I needed to put even more structure into developing these stories. Oh, so here are a few more things. So like in my novels, I like to write novels that are between 80 and 100,000 words. So again, there are tons and tons of exceptions to this. If you write shorter novels, obviously this is going to be different. But in Act 1, you're going to write 20 to 25 scenes, and Act 1 is going to be between 20 and 25,000 words. Act 2 is going to be twice that, and Act 3 is going to be the same as Act 1. So what I did with this, as I was starting to get overwhelmed with my novel, I decided to break it up into even smaller pieces. And so I started watching, because I couldn't concentrate on anything, I started watching a lot of these limited run series on Netflix, and they almost always have 8 episodes. So I started to look at how the episodes were constructed. And I figured out that each of them, like the first 2 were the Act 1, the 4 in the middle were Act 2, basically, and right in the middle there'd be a midpoint, and then Act 3 were going to be the Act 3 would be the last 2 episodes as the story starts to wind down. So what I then did is I broke up. I figured out what I needed to do for each of these acts. And so I was thinking about what all of the elements were for what all the elements that I needed in Act 1 of my story. So I knew, so this is episode 1, and this is episode 2. And together, episode 1 and episode 2 make up the first act. And so I knew that I needed to, episode 1 needed to be between 10,000 and 12, needed between 10 and 12 scenes. So I just needed to, in order to complete this thing, I only needed to come up with 10 to 12 scenes. I also knew that it needed to be between 10,000 and 12.5 thousand words. And one of the elements that I knew needed to either be in episode 1 or in episode 2 was this idea of the I want scene. So if you go back to the analogy of the Wizard of Oz, that's character motivation. So a lot of musicals, if you think about musicals, there's often a song in them that is basically, it's a song about what the character wants. So in The Wizard of Oz, it's Somewhere Over the Rainbow, Dorothy sings that song. And that's really where we understand, we understand what Dorothy's motivation is for the entire novel, for the entire story at that point. She wants to go and explore something outside of Kansas, right? And so when you're thinking about your story, somewhere in either episode 1 or episode 2, you want to have a scene where you're laying out for your reader what it is that your character wants. In one of the examples that we were talking about tonight, we have a murder in a town, we have a victim that no one cares about, and we have a amateur sleuth who's saying, I want to find out what happened to this woman. And the reason I want to find out what happened to this woman is because I have this sense of justice. And the reason I have that sense of justice is because, and you want to really lay that out for your reader. The other item that you're going to want in either episode 1 or episode 2 is this idea of the inciting incident. And so again, in The Wizard of Oz, the inciting incident is Dorothy runs away to save Toto. So then the next thing that happened was these, I decided that these were, because again, I needed to break this novel down into the smallest pieces I possibly could in order to really tackle what I was trying to do. So what I wound up doing was breaking up each of these episodes, so episode 1 and episode 2, into even smaller pieces. So now I broke episode 1 into episode 1A, because I kept thinking to myself, this is cheating a little bit because Netflix, of course, doesn't have commercials. But I kept thinking to myself, a TV show really is broken up into 2 parts. You have it's broken up into many parts though, but really you have a big commercial break in the middle of a TV show. And so I was thinking to myself, what is it that you do what is it when you're creating a TV show? You sort of create a story arc for the first half of the show, and then you create a story arc for the second half of the show. And at the end of each of those story arcs, you have a hook that keeps the viewer engaged in the show through the commercial break. And then at the end of the second half of the show, you have another hook that keeps the reader engaged so that they come back for the second episode. So what I did now was I took and I broke up the first episode of the show into 2 sections. The first one was only 5 to 6 scenes. It was only 5,000 to 6.25 thousand words. And I knew I needed that I want scene in the first part of the, either the first part of the episode or the second part of the episode. And then I wound up doing that for, if you go back to, here's another way of viewing this. So what I wound up doing was writing basically 5,000 word short stories, which I found a lot more manageable. And then I would string those 5,000 word short stories together so that I would have my 20,000 word first act. And wrong way. And so I wound up doing this same activity. So I did that for these first 2 episodes in Act 1, and then I did it for these 4 episodes in Act 2, and then these last 2 episodes in Act 3. I was always trying to make sure that I had that hook that was carrying the characters through each part of the episode, and I was also building in all of the pieces that go into creating any story. So your plot point 1, your midpoint, your plot point 2, your climax, and your denouement. So I'm going to pause there and see what questions people have. Let me get out of sharing.
Edwin, I don't have a question, but I have a comment. Thank you so much for this. It's awesome. One of the things I found really interesting when you're describing the inciting incident and I don't have the language right yet, so I'll just say I think it's really interesting that the I want that Dorothy has is to see something besides Kansas, but the inciting incident, and so she wants something she doesn't have, but the inciting incident is actually to keep something she does have.
Mm-hmm. Which sort of plays well into the story, because what does she ultimately want? She wants to go home.
Yeah.
Yep. Any questions?
So Edwin, this is Carrie Baird. I've got a question for you, and I'll put myself on camera so you know who you're talking to. I'm a person who's just always completely stuck at the beginning. I have a lot of good ideas for the beginning, and the beginning is about 2 pages if I'm lucky. I'm sort of joking here, but what I want to know a couple things. How long does it take you to write? I'm just kind of curious about that. Are there sections that you've described here tonight that take you longer than others? In other words, moving the plot along. And then just a comment, I have to say, as a person who spends most of her life in corporate America, what you just laid out tonight is almost engineer-like, and I can relate to it because I work with a lot of engineers, and it is something that I feel like I could use, and I'm really happy about that. So thank you.
Well, I will tell you that this system was really helpful because what it wound up being was, once you break it out, you basically take each of the episodes and you break them in two. And so what you wind up having to do is write 16 5,000 word short stories.
Right.
And once you write those 16 5,000 word short stories, then of course you have to start sort of pulling them together and making sure that they all work together. But what I liked about breaking it down like that was, it is so, like mentally, it is so much easier to say I'm going to write 5,000 words than it is to say I'm going to write 80,000 words. And being able to break that up into a piece like that, and to make sure that each one of them had their own little story arc. They always had a hook at the end. It made it so that I was always excited about it, because every single thing had something exciting happening in the story. And so like, I think a lot of us, anyone who writes, finds that middle section, that section where you have to come up with 50 scenes and 50,000 or 40 to 50,000 words. I think that can be really, really daunting. But if instead of looking at it as, you know, the middle of a novel with 50,000 words, if you look at it as 8 5,000 word short stories, you can tackle them one at a time, and slowly but surely you have the whole middle of the novel. You know, it can take 2 weeks to write a 5,000 word short story, but two weeks times 8 is only 16 weeks. It's really not that long.
Right. Very helpful. Just one last question. Will you be able to share, or would you be willing to share some of your slides that
Oh yeah. I'll send them to Margaret, and she can distribute them.
Thank you.
So Edwin, do you come up with those plot points first? Like, I'm a big plotter, and I tend to do that. I tend to put in the inciting incident, figure out what my midpoint's going to be, my turning points, and then I fill in between. But like, what advice would you have for a pantser?
I fill in what I know, and I don't always know everything. So I try to have a document that I put together where I put what I know into that document. So I sort of outline all those elements. Ultimately, you always have to have those, or I always do. You have to have a 3x structure. You have to have all those elements in there. And so if I know what some of the elements are, I put them in. But if I don't know what they are, I don't stress about it. But then I'll return to that document 2 weeks later, and I'll ask myself, what do I know about the novel now that I didn't know 2 weeks ago? And maybe maybe in those 2 weeks, I've come up with what the midpoint is, and I'll put that in. But I'll tell you one thing. So with this last book that I was working on, I wrote the first act. I wrote through to the midpoint, and there was a murder at the midpoint. And then I had this conversation with my editor, and he was like, he was like, this is too boring. I mean, that's basically what he said. This is too boring. You need to fix it. And so I was like, okay, whatever. And so I went back to the drawing board. And what I did was I took the midpoint, like that midpoint plot point, and I moved it back. So it became the plot point 1. So I compressed the entire first half of the novel into 1/4 of the novel. And it really made the pace pick up. So like, I always try and find places where I can compress things, where I can pull the action in so that it's more exciting. And I'm always looking at places where I can change what my original plan was. I don't want to get stuck. I don't want to get so stuck in what my original plan was that I'm not allowing the creativity to get me out of whatever situation I'm in. And I love, by the way, I love it when my editor says something's too boring, because I can fix that. And Bruce, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, I got interrupted personally here partway through this. I might have missed something, but when we're talking about a series of 5,000 word short stories, of course, each short story normally has a beginning, middle, and end. And then you also referenced hooks. Are you making hooks at the end of each of those 5,000 words to pull us into the next 5,000 words, et cetera, and then major hooks when we hit plot points?
That's exactly right.
They're like mini hooks. Is that what is that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I try to end every chapter with a hook, but I do try to end each of the 5,000, each of the short, and I'm just using short story, like short story. Yeah. But I try to end each of the 5,000 word sections with a sort of a hook plot. I guess I try to end every chapter with a hook, every 5,000 word section with a hook plus, and then of course the plot points are the major hooks. That's a great way of putting that.
And those 5,000 words, we're talking about multiple scenes, maybe even multiple chapters, right?
Oh yeah. So
Right.
each 5,000 word section will have 5 to 6 scenes, and it will
Okay.
have as many chapters as you want. You could have one chapter, or you could have multiple chapters.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions?
I've often heard of the dark moment. Where would the dark moment fall into this?
Oh my God, I don't know what, I've never heard that term. What does it mean?
So I think it comes from Christopher Grayson's
Yeah,
kind of story arc novel. And so the dark moment is when all hope is lost. Everything seems like they can't succeed. The protagonist basically has failed.
yeah,
And then comes the light, the revelation, whether that's a mentor giving them some advice or
yeah.
whatever. So
I think the dark moment, I do know what you're talking about. And I think the dark moment comes in the second half of Act 2. I think it comes in the middle of the second half of the second act. Does that make sense? I
Yeah.
can show you actually on the screen where it comes.
Yeah, it seems like it comes before, I mean, it obviously has to come before the climax. So that would make sense.
It comes, let me just show you.
So after plot point 2 or,
Yeah, it comes after the midpoint. It comes right in between the midpoint and plot point 2. So sort of right here. Can you see my cursor?
so kind of all hope is lost and then something else happens. to
Exactly.
kind of
But I
drive
would
that.
confirm that because I don't feel like I'm an expert on that. I would confirm that by searching that on the internet.
Yeah, I'm thinking in Christopher Grayson's, it might be plot point 2 kind of drives that dark moment. Like
Yep.
whatever happens there, it looks like failure. And then that drives that third act. I'll have to look. I
Yeah.
can't quite remember.
Yes.
I was just looking at if you follow the format of the Save the Cat screenplay formatting, they have a section called The Dark Night of the Soul, which is
Yep.
right before the break into Act 3. So I think where you're suggesting it, Edwin, is about the same place.
Yep.
Yep.
I will tell you, there are people who are really into structure and they're called structure geeks. Like I get overloaded on too much structure. So the most I can handle is the 3-act structure, but there's like a million, if you're into this stuff, there are a million resources out there. And I like totally, they're real for people they're useful for, they're really useful. And there are like so many different models that you can follow. I have a website I'll put it in the chat that you can look at. Let me just find that. Where did I put that? Oh, I don't have it in this one. You know, I'll add it to the slides when I send them to Margaret. And I'll put that website with all the structure stuff in there. But yeah, Save the Cat's a great example of something that where the structure is much more structuralized than I can personally handle. But a lot of people really love that stuff.
Edwin, I do have a follow-up question. You have a lot of scenes, and my sort of personal general rule of thumb is if I change scenes, it's either because there's a change in time or a change in place. And usually that works. Now and then I get into problems. If I have a really long scene, I kind of feel the need to break it up. And I see it a lot in books that particularly are emphasizing pace, where we're in the middle essentially of a single scene and they just stop or a single chapter or a long scene, and they'll just stop in the middle of it because they want to finish with a dramatic line or dramatic hook. And then the very next scene, picks up literally 10 seconds later. Do you have a philosophy about that, or your own instincts of writing? I've always been curious about how other writers handle that sort of break with scenes.
Oh, I mean, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think first, I read all of my novels so far have been multiple point of views. So I switch between characters, which like automatically gives you a new scene, which is
Right.
helpful.
Sure.
But you know, I define a scene as a single interaction around a single point of conflict. So you can have in a single location. So you can have scenes between characters. You can have multiple scenes between characters where, like, if two characters are in the kitchen talking about something, and they go into the living room and talk about that, for me, that's a change of scene. Or if the point of conflict changes, or if someone else comes into the scene. So if you have a scene between two people and a third person comes in, for me, that's a change of scene as well. But I do, you know, just for as far as marketability, I mean, I would encourage you not to have scenes that go on for
Right.
pages and pages and pages and pages. Readers like things to move quickly.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions?
Ready?
I'm just going to put my website in the chat there. And I love here, if you think of something, or if you just want to drop me a note, just look me up. But I always love hearing from other writers. And I'm actually I'm the chair of the education committee for Sisters in Crime National. So I put on a lot of programs there. Flora, I may be in touch with you about doing something about writing for children. You know, stop by Sisters in Crime once in a while, the national chapter as well. We do lots of really awesome programming there if you ever have a chance.
Excellent.
Awesome.
Any other questions? Well, thank you so much, Edwin.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
It was great.
Yes.
I always like the different perspective and breaking things down and thinking of things differently.
Yes.
Gets the brain working again.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate you being our guest tonight, Edwin.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So nicely organized and easy to understand. So thank you. Yes.
Thank you.
Typically after the meeting, those who want to just stay around and visit can, and those who want to just sign off can do that too. So thank you everyone for coming, and have a good night. I guess Edwin's night is getting pretty late.
It is. I'm on vacation officially as soon as I log off. So I'm gonna head on out, and I look forward to, hopefully we'll be able to see people in person one of these days. I hope to see you sometime.